Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Markus Voelter. Based in Stuttgart, Markus is an independent consultant, language engineer, and author who helps organizations uncover, understand, and operationalize the knowledge at the core of their business, building a common foundation between business and IT. You can follow him on Twitter at Markus Voelter, that's Voelter, and check out his website at voelter.de. He's also the founder and longtime host of the Omega Tau podcast, which covers really interesting topics in science and engineering, and I highly recommend it. In addition to the other books he has written, Markus is the author of the Leanpub book, How to Understand Almost Anything, A Practitioner's Guide to Domain Analysis. In this interview, we're going to talk about Markus's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a writer and content creator. So thank you very much, Markus, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Cool.
I always like to ask people on the podcast for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found yourself interested in the career that you sort of built for yourself.
Well, I grew up in a city called Heidenheim that is about 70 kilometers east of Stuttgart, small city. When I went to school, I went to keep it short, a kind of technical high school with lots of emphasis on science and computing and stuff. So I started programming there, I think in the 6th grade or something. And basically then I just never stopped. I studied technical physics and not computer science at the time, because at the time I thought I knew everything. So there's no point in studying computer science. So let's study something useful, right? It wasn't a great idea in retrospect, but in the end it didn't really matter. I did a PhD in computer science then in 2014. So now I can actually call myself a computer scientist. I couldn't based on my university education, the original one. So, and then I don't know, I somehow stumbled into this whole modeling, code generation, domain-specific language thing. I started in the early 2000s with UML, because at the time that was the only way to create, boxes and lines or kind of abstract descriptions of stuff. And I quickly got fed up with that stuff and moved more towards domain-specific languages. I played a lot or worked a lot with Xtext. Also, I would say between 2004 and maybe 6, 7. And then in around 2008 and 9, I stumbled into MPS, JetBrains metaprogramming system. And since then, I mostly built DSLs using MPS. And my role is a mix of technical consulting around the tool and how to actually implement these things, and kind of, my current book, domain analysis. How do you actually figure out what should go into a language? How does something work in order then to abstract it into a language? So that's the short story.
You mentioned UML, which is Universal Markup Language. Is that what that stands for?
No, useless modeling language. Unified modeling language.
Unified modeling language. Okay. A former guest of the podcast, Simon Brown, will probably shoot me if he hears this for me getting that wrong. But yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, was your interest always from the start at sort of like understanding things from the kind of hierarchical, abstract kind? Well, no, abstract isn't the right kind of word, but like...
No, it is. Yeah,
okay.
It is. I think it is. I started, my first, if you will, career was enterprise infrastructures, enterprise Java beans, middleware, Corba, that kind of stuff. Did quite a bit of work there. Also wrote books in that space. And then for some reason, I got more interested in the conceptual stuff and no more in the if you will, in the weeds of the implementation technologies. And actually, the funny thing is, when I was a bit younger, I remember in the late 90s, in my first kind of real commercial projects, I was making fun about these slightly older people who weren't interested in technology and all the newest frameworks and shit. And I prided myself in always knowing the most recent technologies in the Java space mostly. And this has completely changed. I couldn't care less, it's a bit of an exaggeration, about the newest XYZ framework. I have completely moved over, not into it's not just, people I love even more about is requirements engineers who have moved so far away from programming and computing that they only talk about high level business stuff. I'm not that person, but I do enjoy getting deep into the details of particular domains, trying to understand them, systematize them, find abstractions for describing them. And I'm no longer very interested in the latest technology stuff. And don't ask me why.
Oh, okay, I won't. But if I'm a clever podcast host, I'll find a way of asking it indirectly or getting to an answer indirectly. But anyway, it's interesting. So you mentioned that you finished your PhD in computer science in 2014. What was the subject of your PhD dissertation?
Yeah, so it was. I have to explain this a bit more. So I at the time I was as a freelancer mostly working with a company called Itemis. It's a German medium-sized consulting company, and at that company we were working quite a bit with domain-specific languages and MPS, and we got a research project there called Embedder with a couple of other companies where we implemented the C programming language in MPS because that allowed us to extend C with new language constructs optimized for embedded software development. So we built, we counted at one point, I think it was 37 or something, independent modular extensions of C for various aspects of embedded software. And so we had this research project, and I basically did my PhD at the University of Delft as an external PhD student about this thing. So we did the research project in the company, and I did a little bit of, academic stuff around it, wrote papers, published stuff, but it was kind of very synergistic with my work at the time, which was this research project. And I did the PhD with Elko Visser. I knew him from conferences. At the time, we were also planning to write a book together. That didn't quite work because he was way too busy. But so we got in touch, and at some point, I think it was he who proposed whether I would be interested to do a PhD with him. And I said yes. And so that's how that happened.
It's always great to start with a relationship.
Yes.
Those things can go bad for those who know them. That's really interesting. Actually, it leads me to ask a version of a question that comes up on the podcast pretty frequently, particularly given the many different generations of authors that we've had, and so many of them are sort of in IT and things like that.
Yeah.
If you were starting out now in 2023 with the intention of having the career you've had, would you formally study computer science as an undergraduate, let's say starting at 18, or would you choose another path?
So I think I would say I would, yes. And the reason is, it was true that at the time I kind of knew everything I needed to know in practice to do actual software development. I mean, more or less proven by the fact that I've kind of made it a little bit in this field, right? So, but what I notice these days is that I actually sometimes do miss some of the foundations. Like I once did an interview with Google, job interview, and they were asking about, complexity theory and O()() and performance, and I just have absolutely no clue. I remember with a buddy of mine, a colleague at the time, we were spending like literally 2 days to figure out how to sort something because we didn't know that the kind of sorting we needed is called topological sort. And if we had known that, we could have Googled it, and then after 10 minutes, with Stack Overflow or whatever, and we were so clueless that we didn't even know what it was that we didn't know. So in retrospect, I would probably study computer science, also because the stuff I did study, I never worked in that field anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for that answer. I think that's a very, very thoughtful and sort of a from experience answer for why one should study, which is what I like.
Yes, exactly.
it's
But by the way, sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
At the
no,
time, if I had studied it and I would have been forced to learn all this fundamental stuff, I would probably have said, I don't need this. Who needs this theory crap? So at the time, I think it would be hard to accept that it's useful, but in retrospect, it is, or it would have been.
yeah, no, that's a very good articulation of, I think, of a paradox at the heart of what education is, right? And it's an ancient kind of and sort of unresolvable problem, which is, my clever little saying for it is like, being educated gives you a power that must be possessed in order to be perceived. And once you have this sort of foundation of knowledge of things, you can see where they can be applied. But you have to have it before you can see the application. Martial arts are similar in a certain kind of way. And so when you're a student and you're learning it, you just have to kind of trust your teacher. And you have to give yourself over. And sometimes you give yourself over to bad teachers. Sometimes
exactly. I was going to say that.
Sometimes you give yourself over to bad systems, and that can be very unfortunate. And so the people I've talked to on the podcast who've given sort of the other answer, which is no, I wouldn't. Some of them did go to university for computer science. Some of them didn't, or whether it's computer science or the thing that they ended up in. Sometimes they're like, I really wish I'd done it. Other times they're like, I did it and it was a total waste of time. And often I find when it's the latter, it's probably because they unfortunately had a very bad experience. But, I remember my background is in English literature. That's what I studied in university. And I remember a debate when I was a graduate student at one university where they were talking about getting rid of the language requirement. So there was a requirement that you needed to have 2 languages. In addition, I was studying English, so everyone knew English, but there was a language requirement that you needed to have 2 other languages. And I remember being at a faculty meeting. I was a faculty representative and a faculty member said, I had to learn 2 languages myself. The second one I learned was Latin, and I never used it. It was a total waste of time. And I remember thinking, you piece of shit. Like, the fact that you didn't fucking use your knowledge of Latin in your career as a professor of English literature is not anyone else's fault. I don't know what to say, so that's a pretty harsh thing. But, basically, if you have the time and you have the money to study in your youth, to spend years devoted to study in your youth, I'm personally very much on the side of doing it. As long as you have a good place to go, as long as it's not completely against your nature. If it is, don't fight that too hard.
Yeah, sure. I was in Germany, we have these things called Fachhochschule. It's kind of an applied university. And I was at one of those, and they claim to be more practically oriented, right? So if you go to a quote normal university, you know that you're going to learn lots of theory stuff you'll never need. And it's fine. You know that going in. In this more applied university where they claim that whatever you learn is useful in practice, it is even more annoying if you then have to learn, for example, programming a robot that is programmed in a programming language that IBM invented 20 years earlier, nobody used, which is why people gave away the robots to the university. So now we can learn a supposedly practically relevant skill, robot programming, with a language that is not used by anybody. And that made it sometimes hard for me to learn some of this stuff because it was supposed to be practical, but then it wasn't.
I could talk about this subject for a very long time. I think we're both, it sounds like we're both kind of passionate about it. I mean, the sort of the really harsh way I have of putting it is like, if you're 18 and your professors are presenting something to you and you're just starting out learning something that you don't know, which is why you have professors and why you're at a university, and they're presenting things to you that seem practical to you, they might be selling you something, right? Because like you actually don't, you know what I mean? They're thinking about you as an 18-year-old and what's going to appeal to you and seem practical to you and maybe to your parents or something like that.
Yeah.
And like there's a history of that kind of thing happening, particularly in the American education system, where when kids were basically I'm not going to go too far down this rabbit hole. When public education became a forced thing, a lot of kids were taken off the farm, basically. And a lot of parents had the number of kids they had because they needed twice that many hands at work on the farm. And so one way when all those kids were being taught to do useless things like read and do math, right? Their parents were like, well, why aren't you teaching them anything practical? So So the education system's like, fine, we'll make shop class, and it wasn't because they really valued that. There's a version of that that can happen. And where I grew up in a place where there were basically an agricultural part of Canada where a lot of people complained that what they were learning in university wasn't practical in their 18-year-old terms and would leave before they got their education because they felt that they were wasting their time. Whereas, of course, if they could just stick it through. So that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this. And it's such an important thing. But once again, not everyone has the opportunity. Not everyone has the inclination. If it's totally against your nature, don't go. But But also, like, you trust. It also, there is just this paradox that you have to trust that at the end of that time, you're going to know things and that do have practical application, that you just can't know what their application is until you know them. So anyway, that's my long rant. But going back to you, I'm curious, have you been sort of like independent as a consultant for your whole career, or did you start
almost
for companies? Okay.
No, I started as a freelancer while I was studying, just to make money on the side, as everybody did, and I forgot to stop this, right? And I was employed for 22 months by a small software consulting company, which then more or less went bankrupt as part of the .com bust. So I was kind of freelancer before, and then I just went back to that proven practice afterwards. And since then, I've done that, and now I guess I'm unemployable because I'm completely allergic to anything that smells like company politics, and so I think it's too late now. So I have to continue this until I die.
And I'm curious, there are a lot of people for whom they'd actually like to have that life, or they think they would. But did you have a guide, like someone or someone to sort of tell you how to do it, or did you just sort of dive in and find clients?
It was easy for me to find stuff to work on, interesting stuff during university, and so it just was almost like a continuum. But when I finished studying, I just did a bit more of the work thing, and so I just stumbled into it. I don't know. Well, I never decided to do that, right? It just happened.
That's really interesting. I think, because most of the people I've interviewed, there was a sort of, there's a conventional story, which is, I sort of went to university or what have you, or started designing websites or something like that, and then got my first company job and sort of went up the ladder, and then decided at one point, you know what, I'm allergic to company culture, or else the role I want to play in the work that I do doesn't sort of match with being formally part of an organization that I want to help. I think is often what happens. So that's really interesting. So before we go on to talk about to the next part of the interview, to talk about your book, I wanted to talk, and so this is an explicit podcast, so pardon my using a swear word to congratulate.
That's fine. Actually, I wanted to ask you if I'm allowed to use.
You're totally allowed to swear, but I'm going to use it. Anyone in the car with their kids, I'm going to use a swear word to compliment Markus about his podcast. It's a fucking great podcast. I was looking at it and I was just like saving every episode. I can't believe I didn't know about it until now. But so for anyone interested, the Omega Tau podcast, it's in German and in English. I wish my German were good enough that I could listen to the German episodes. But I mean, Markus gets to interview, like, it's crazy. It's like 3-hour interviews about, how things work at CERN, or literally like F-35 test pilots talking about like flying the planes in detail.
The best thing I was able to do as part of the podcast, I was able to fly in one of these jet fighters. I got to fly in the F-16 with the Thunderbirds. This was a dream that I had. I'm a huge aviation nerd, right? So since I was like 8, the F-16 was my favorite airplane. I don't know why. Beautiful. I just fell in love with it. And I started the podcast in 2008 with my then girlfriend. And one of the reasons for starting it was that at that time, a US podcaster, I forgot his name now, he got to fly with the Thunderbirds as a media ride. And I said, okay, got to start a podcast too. And I want to reach that same goal. And in 2019, it actually worked. So I got to fly, and that was the total experience of a lifetime. So since then, it's a bit of a problem, motivating myself for the podcast because I won't ever be able to top that, right? So anyway,
that's
podcast
that's
story.
great. That's a great sort of it's interesting. It only took you 11 years to achieve your goal, but there you did, and that must have been such an amazing.
I tell you, this was unbelievably cool. Fucking great is probably the term.
Were you okay? You didn't get sick or anything like that?
Of course. I mean, no, I've been flying gliders in aerobatics forever, so I had no problem at all.
So for anyone interested, maybe they have a similar kind of goal and interested in starting a podcast. So how did you, how did you start out getting guests when you're sort of a brand new podcast? You don't have any sort of past episodes to point people to or anything like that, if you recall.
The first episode, I was the guest because of the problem of finding some. The second episode, I think, was with a local weather forecasting meteorology person that I met in Stuttgart. Episode number 3, maybe it was the other way around, was Nora's sister's husband's father. He was a professor for the kind of medical stuff we talked about. So we bootstrapped it basically with people we knew. And also at the time, there weren't 5 million other podcasts like that. I mean, today, it's also one of the reasons why I've slowed down a bit recently. There is lots of kind of similar podcasts. I mean, for example, Lex Fridman's podcast is the canonical example. He's also, I guess, 5 million times bigger than we are. But at the time, it was, you just approached people and they didn't know much about podcasting, right? It was new. You gave people 3 hours to talk about the subject instead of 3 minutes, where they were misquoted by, mainstream media. And so many of them were actually quite happy to be able to tell their story, and we gave them a forum. Today, it's hard to find guests, despite our history, because there's, again, 5 million other similar podcasts in YouTube formats and stuff like that. So it wasn't that complicated, I guess. And of course we built, right? We didn't start with the F-35 test pilot.
I'm actually curious, just, having done podcasts since 2011 myself. Did you, nowadays, again, one of the reasons there's such a profusion of podcasts is everyone's got Zoom now. Zoom works great. You hit the record button, blah, blah. Back in the day, we used Skype. What did you use at the time?
Same here. I used Skype. When I started, I bought I forget the name now. It is basically a little black box that you plug between your analog phone line so you could record actual phone, because not everybody had computers at the time. Now everybody has, right? So you don't need anything else except the usual 5 different IP-based voice things, right? At the time, I actually recorded the phone physically. And also, we always did a lot of stuff like in person, because, again, my main motivation was to go places, go to people, visit stuff, do stuff, right? Enjoy, experience things, and do the podcast only as an excuse for getting in the door.
Yeah, it's that's really interesting for any sort of budding podcasters. One of the most important things to pick is something that you actually care about.
Yes,
that you actually want to do, and depending on what you're up to, right? But you could be. There's a great podcast out there called Shameless Acquisition Target by someone who created a podcast with the intention of getting it acquired. There's people like that, but if you're not like that, one of the keys to success is to actually do a podcast about something you actually care about, because in a sense, you can't fail. If no one listens, but you got to talk to so and so. You win, and that's one of the great things about it, and also too, as you were saying, again, it's a bit different today because there's it's a popular format now that people are familiar with, but at the time the idea of someone sort of, as they would say in Australia, just rocking up and asking you, hey, can I talk to you, asking you good questions for hours about something you care, you know about. Surprise, surprise, people are like, absolutely, I want to do that.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Exactly.
And I can't wait. So just moving on to the next part of the interview where we talk about your book, your
Yep.
latest book, which is How to Understand Almost Anything, A Practitioner's Guide to Domain Analysis. It's got a really great title and it's got a really great cover. We can maybe talk about that detail in the last part of the interview. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the book is about and who it's for.
Yes. Yeah. So imagine you're a company that builds software for tax advisors, where tax advisors can enter, their clients' financial stuff, right? And then the program spits out how much tax they have to pay in the 5 million different tax categories. That company has the challenge of essentially implementing all of the German tax code as executable software as part of this product they're selling, right? So they have lots and lots and lots of people at the company who understand tax law and then somehow through some mechanism have to get it into software, right? I could tell an exactly similar story for example, I don't know, medical drug trials. These trials are highly regulated. You have to be very precise about how you run them, when you give which drug, when you then measure the fever, which questions you ask, how people feel. So you have to formally specify how one of these trials works. So you have experts, same story, right? You have experts who know how to design these trials. They get high-level medical requirements, and then they, quote, program such a trial algorithm, right? Lots of other examples like that. So whenever you have software where the software isn't about software, it's actually about something else, you have to get the something else into the software, right? And the point is that the people who know about the something else at your company usually are software engineers. They are something else experts, subject matter experts, as we call them. So the traditional way is to get this stuff into the software, they basically write documents. 20 years ago, we called them requirement documents. Then we called them user stories. Now we call them user experience, blah something. But it's basically always text and a bunch of tables. And then you give this to developers, they misunderstand 50% of it and implement something else. And so this cycle from the brain of the subject matter expert into the software system is very, very leaky and tedious and error prone and all these other adjectives. So a better way of doing this, and I'll get to domain analysis in 1 second. A better way of doing this is to build a language or a tool or a modeling language, use whatever word you want, with which you can formally, in an executable way, describe tax law, drug trials, whatever it is. You build this language in a way that is usable by these non-programmer domain experts, subject matter experts. And then they just, quote, program or model or specify tax law, drug trials with this custom language. And then you build a compiler that makes it executable. So this is basically the story for domain-specific languages or model-driven development or generative development or code generation or whatever you want. Just thousands of different terms that all mean the same thing. So basically the question is, how do you build that language? How do you know what gets into the language? How do you describe all of the German tax law or drug trials? How do you do that? What's the vocabulary? How do you form sentences? I mean, the usual questions in language design, in programming language design. So that's basically it. You want to understand how domain works because you want to abstract it into a set of consistent abstractions, which you then package into a modeling tool or DSL tool. Doesn't matter if it's textual or diagrams or tables or buttons. It doesn't matter. It's a formal set of abstractions with which your non-programmer domain experts can express the stuff in their domain for analysis and execution.
Yeah, thanks very much for that really great explanation. It's interesting that you bring up, and I know you use the example of sort of German tax law when you give talks and things like that. I've watched a couple on YouTube, preparing for the interview. And one thing I find so interesting about that, particularly the tax example, is that there's a set of texts out there that describe tax law, and there's a sense in which they might be very rigorous individually, but there's also a sense in which the whole thing is quite arbitrary, because where does it come from? It comes from a parliament kind of making up rules, and so when you're then the sort of like tax service provider, you have to. It's actually not on the sort of government to actually sort of provide this kind of language. It's on you as the company to create this language to try and capture what they're doing.
Yes, and in an ideal world, right, it should be the government who write their laws in an executable way, right? And there is actually a whole discipline of, formal law, executable law. It's not nobody does it in practice. There are some relatively funny attempts by governments to, for example, formally specify parts of the tax law. It's crap.
That's super interesting. The thought popped into my head when I was doing the research for the interview. I was like, I wonder if there actually is anyone in any government anywhere who's actually trying to do this. And then I thought, sure, would never get anywhere.
There is certainly somebody somewhere.
Sure.
For example, the Dutch tax agency, which isn't the government, but it's the official government body who calculates the official taxes. It's not a service provider. It's the government agency. They use the same approach, right? They use DSLs, actually also based on MPS. But they also have the problem of basically having to reinterpret and formalize the imprecise stuff that comes from the parliament. And I guess, from the parliament's perspective, I think this imprecision is a feature and not a bug, right? Because they want to be ambiguous to get their body's loophole hidden somewhere. But if you strip away the political part and look at, for example, drug trials where you don't have that problem, right? So there's lots of domains where you should start formalizing as early as possible, right? To never get into this problem of having to reinterpret the ambiguous prose into something more formal. If everybody always directly used the technical language, right, the formal language, then it would be a better situation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to sort of trying to we'll drill in maybe to some specific examples in a bit, but talking about things at this level, there's a great sort of move you pull at the beginning of your book, where you're defining terms, right? And you say, what is domain analysis? A domain is a bounded area of knowledge and expertise. Domain analysis is about understanding that body of knowledge, the subject matter of a domain. And it's interesting. You then you give three different examples so you use this term subject matter, but there's actually subject matter can then differentiate into different types of things. And so you say, for example, in a system that creates monthly salary and wage statements for employees, the subject matter comprises the rules that determine what counts as working time, etc. Then you say in digital therapeutics applications that guide patients through specific medical treatment, the subject matter is, whereas before it was comprises the rules, it is the set of data structures, algorithms, decision procedures, and correctness criteria, etc. And then the third example you give is a radio telescope, and you say the subject matter is, in this case, not the rules that determine something, not the set of data structures, etc., but the set of parameters needed to perform successful observation. And I love the fact that you very clearly set out that this sort of subject matter idea can take different forms, and that they can actually have, but they're internally coherent, and there are ways of addressing them. And it was
you might be giving the author of that book too much credit for thinking deeply here. Maybe that's just how it came out.
Well, whether it's, it may in a sense have been accidental, but it was also kind of necessary, right? Because the three different examples that you chose actually show how this subject matter idea is different in these different ways.
Yes.
And speaking of sort of deep thinking, what I kept thinking about was Hegel when I was reading through the book, the German philosopher, for those who aren't familiar with him. But one thing that I mean, I just recall this from my undergraduate days, but one of the great kind of reversals that Hegel pulls on you is between the concepts of abstract and concrete.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, most people would think that like, what you're seeing around you, like say the sort of the building that you're in, that's concrete. And he could say, what could be more abstract than the arbitrary building you happen to find yourself in? Or in the sense of like, but what he says is the value that we attribute to things that we think are concrete, we actually should ascribe that value to things that we think are abstract, because nothing could be more firm and permanent than, say, the rules of logic or something like that, or the laws of nature. And the sort of things that we think of as abstract are actually incredibly concrete. The particular manifestation of them, that's actually kind of abstract, right? Like the building that I'm in, the time I was born into, things like that. So anyway, but when I was thinking about these, the sort of very ambitious title about how to understand almost everything, how does that work? And it works when you see things that way to some extent.
Yeah, I'm not responsible for the title. That was my marketing department. As you know, when you write books, right, somebody else, not the author, is coming up with a kind of catchy title. So it's not my fault.
Mm-hmm.
But I did put in the almost, right, so that it doesn't sound.
That's a very author. It's a very author move.
But seriously, I mean, I was actually when I first talked about the book, kind of on LinkedIn and stuff, people did suggest to remove the almost, right? And I was I wouldn't do that because it sounds too grandiose, right? I think it's just, I don't want to do that. So the almost is important.
That's super interesting to hear that. I would agree. I think it actually makes it sound. I mean, personally, and I was thinking about it. Like, I think it makes it sound more ambitious to actually put the almost in there, adding some subtlety to that. Sort of isn't.
It's also an alliteration, right? So that's also always good. So, so I mean, very well. Crafted title.
Yeah, I know. Marketing but anyway, so sort of getting more into sort of like the details of why would someone come up with the kind of why would someone be a language engineer? What is the need for having a sort of way of understanding almost everything?
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it in the interview already, but the concept of a subject matter expert, this sort of SME or this specific term.
Yeah.
When you've got a company and everything's software nowadays, so you're going to have the kind of like the people who let's carry on with the sort of tax idea, right? There's the tax experts and there's the programmers. And a lot of what you're doing is trying to get those two groups to have the same terminology.
Say the word language.
Language,
That's
right? Yeah,
exactly
have the same language, so that you don't need to be a programmer to talk to the programmer about what you need implemented.
Yes.
If you're the tax expert, and if you're the software developer, and you're like, well, hold on a second here, I don't really understand what you're talking about. You don't need to be a tax expert to talk back.
Yes.
But what you both need to know is this shared thing that you developed in your
exactly. Right. Yes, and you're emphasizing something very important, because when I say let's build a way of working where the tax people can deal with tax shit and don't have to know anything about scalability and performance and robustness and all this programming stuff, and at the same time the technical people don't have to understand and spend days and days and days and days implementing all this tax crap they really don't care about. Even at the tax company, the developers don't care about the tax stuff, right? It is boring, let's face it. So when I say I want to organize things in a way where these two are kind of separate, everybody can focus on their own, whatever they're interested in. I'm kind of, people say, well, you want to separate these two groups and that's not agile, and today we all have to be friends and we have to collaborate. Yes, absolutely, and that's what I'm trying to do, right? Like you say, I want to build, if you will, a contract between the subject matter experts and the technical people. The contract says, here is the set of things you technical people have to be able to execute. Everything I can express with this language, you have to be able to run. So please build me a compiler or an interpreter or whatever magic you can come up with. If I give you a valid sentence in the language, you run it, right? At the same time, the language built by technical people and people like me, right? Language engineers, domain analysis, whatever, together with the subject matter people, of course, it says, here is the exact degrees of freedom you have when describing subject matter, text, whatever, right? And so there is now, when the compiler doesn't work, the technical people know what they need to fix because they have to run the language. Similarly, if the text people notice they can't express something, then the language is obviously flawed. So we have to improve the language, but at the same time, because that's the contract, now the technical people know what they have to run. So in my experience, this actually improves the collaboration between the two, if you will, flavors of people in most organizations.
Right. And so, for example, what that would mean is that there would be various, I imagine there would be various kind of like, typically, as I think you mentioned in the book, typically the systems have a hierarchy to them. And so you can sort of come up with terms to define various levels of the hierarchy. And I imagine that, for example, like if a new tax law were passed, would you sort of then have a kind of like, let's say like a branch at a certain level of the hierarchy that would happen, and you'd give a term to that, you would be able to sort of show someone, would it work like that, or?
It depends. I mean, if like in this concrete case that we've built, right? If a new tax law would be passed, I would say there's a chance 99 point something % that the existing language can express it. So, the subject matter expert would try to understand that law, would open their modeling tool, text modeling tool, and would start trying to express it. And again, 99 point something % it would work. They would write tests, right? So they have the green test bubbles, text calculations correct. And they might, run into a limitation of the language where it's extremely verbose to write it down, or it's not even possible. Like, for example, there is one case, at least one case in German tax law, where you actually have to perform a fixed point calculation. Like you have to compute until nothing changes in order to allocate certain things. That is not something our language was able to do initially. So, and you couldn't program it with the language because the language is not a general purpose programming language, right? It's optimized for text stuff. And so therefore it wasn't possible for the subject matter people to implement this requirement, if you will. So we had to enhance the language. That happens, but it's rare because during domain analysis, you spend time trying to explore the whole domain and build a language that can cover it.
And obviously this model could be applied to something like the GDPR.
GDPR? You mean the strange law that the cookie banners?
I'm making probably too much of an insider joke, but when basically like let's say for example you're a Canadian online publishing platform,
yeah,
and all of a sudden there's 300 pages of European regulation that you need to comply with.
Well, the problem is with GDPR is that it is okay, let's step back. The nice thing about tax law is it's basically about making decisions and calculating. I'm not familiar enough with GDPR beyond the cookie banner on my website that I could say whether this is a domain that is like a good fit for this kind of approach. It's hard to say. I would have to look into that.
Fair enough. I imagine one of the challenges would be, like, for example, if this new thing that's been dumped on my desk, and like, I'm being asked, does what you do apply to this? And if you're like, this is way too arbitrary, might be one of the reasons. Like, there's just an infinite range of degrees of freedom, and so
so you wouldn't be able to find good abstractions, for example. And we had this, right? We were building a language for for all things for how do you efficiently run pumps and other stuff in a refrigerator to optimally cool the thing in an energy efficient way, right? So when you open the fridge door, right, obviously heat comes in, gets warmer, you close the door. Now what do? Do you start the pump to cool it down again, or do you think, well, maybe the guy just opened the fridge and probably put something out, they'll open the door again in 20 seconds. And so I'm not going to start the pump for 20 seconds. And so we were thinking, or actually we were prototyping, building a language for that. And it turns out these cooling algorithms are so arbitrary that you can't find abstractions. It's completely empirical, right? There's a guy in the basement in a white lab coat who does measurements all day long, every day, all year. And so whatever he comes up with, he codes, or somebody codes up in C, and you just couldn't find abstractions. So that does happen, but it's relatively rare.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I mean, it's interesting that sort of what you're doing is sort of in very many ways kind of scientific, right? And you're using scientific terms like degrees of freedom and then things like that, to try and basically, like, you go out and encounter some phenomenon in the world and try and come up with a framework for understanding it.
Yes.
So there's really interesting things in the book. There's this very particular interesting passage near the beginning again where you talk about the engine, which is super interesting. And I guess without going into too many details, I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what you mean when you use the word engine.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you describe, so if you have a language, let's say Java, right? And you write a Java program. In order to run that Java program, you have a compiler that transforms it into bytecode, and then you have a interpreter that, today it's an just-in-time compiler, blah blah blah. But it's basically kind of a bytecode interpreter that executes the bytecode that you got as the output from your compiler. And so basically, if you have a black box into which you put a Java program, and at the other end of the black box you get the behavior, right? It's executed. You get the semantics come out of it. Whatever it runs. So this black box is what I call the engine, and I call it so in this kind of abstract term because I don't care if it is a compiler or an interpreter or a combination of the two, like in Java, or whatever else you could come up with. The only requirement is, on the one side, you feed programs or models expressed with your, with the abstractions for your domain, with your language, right? And it runs it, whatever it does. I don't care. And the thing is, this is not a technical book, right? I wrote previous books about the technical parts, and there I would discuss the trade-offs between interpreters and code generators and compilers and blah, 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 blah. In this book, it just doesn't matter. The only important thing is you have the model, which is built with your nicely abstracted language that you found during domain analysis, and you run. Full stop. Make it work. Technical problem, we don't care.
Yeah, and it's I think if I understand it correctly, what's sort of going on here is that it's not sort of like saying I don't care because it doesn't matter. What it's saying is, like, it's providing this sort of concept that people on either side of that engine can share, so that they can do that they need to do.
In practice, of course, it doesn't matter. You have to build this thing. Yeah. But in this book, I treat it as something that is, quote, just work. Right? Somebody has to build it.
But again, like, the crucial, but like, ideal, in an ideal world, if you're on one side of that engine, the output side, you can talk to the people on the input side, and neither of you would necessarily need to understand what's going on in the engine. Is that right?
Well, I mean, you have to. So the people who build the engine, which is programmers, right? They have to understand what the language means. If you have a language with 25 keywords and you can compose them in whatever ways, then, I mean, you have to write code that, understands, meaning runs,
right,
any program expressed in that language. So the programmers have to understand the details of the engine. The people who create the models don't have to understand the details of the engine, but they also have to know what the language means, right? You cannot use a language if you don't know what it means when you write down as a particular sentence. But you don't understand that by, digging through the Java code that implements the engine. What you do is you write tests, or you have other debuggers, simulators, ideas from live programming. You write a bit of model in your language and you see something do stuff, right? And you can directly, that makes sense, right? So in the text case, we have ways of testing your calculations. You can basically put in the data of a kind of text subject and you see what the outcome is. And then the text guy can see if the model they created is correct. In the drug trial thing, we can simulate whole executions of these trials, and you can see which drug or which I don't know, questionnaire or examination or patient visit happens on which day and what the outcome is. Get nice charts and stuff. So so that's how that would work.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense to me now. Thanks very much for clarifying that. You mentioned your other books, which gives me a great opportunity to segue into the third part of the interview, where we talk about your experience as a writer and content creator and things like that. So, were you always interested in writing, or was your first book kind of, was it something that you approached a publisher about, or did someone pull it out of you? If you could.
I used the trusted approach of relationship first. So.
Right.
The first book I wrote is called Server Component Patterns, and it was basically patterns about this, enterprise Java Beans Core component-based middleware. And at the time, I was visiting the EuroPLOP conference every year. PLOP stands for Pattern Languages of Programming, so it's a patterns conference. And so I stumbled into that one. I forget why. And so I visited there every year and wrote pattern papers for the conference. And then at some point, one of the gurus there, Frank Buschmann, who at the time was editing a series at Wiley, a book series on different patterns, he basically asked me and three buddies of mine whether we weren't interested in writing a book. And so somehow happened. And that was the first book. And since I've written a couple of them, it must be to some degree enjoyable, maybe. It doesn't feel like it necessarily all the time, but there must be something, otherwise I wouldn't do it repeatedly. For me as a freelancer, it's of course also a marketing tool, right? I don't have a career, I can't point to a title, so I have to do various other ways of, advertising my skills. And so it's the usual stuff, right? It's conference talks and it's books.
And if I recall correctly, you invite feedback on your book as well. Yeah, there you go, right in the introduction there. Is that something that you've always done?
Not as explicitly, maybe. I suspect that every writer would say, if you have please tell me what you think about our book, and if you have enhancements or suggestions, please tell me. So, I guess it's probably in the prefaces of probably most books, of most books. But in this book's case, I'm particularly serious about it because this book is not a technical book, right? There's no objective right or wrong. You can disagree with almost all of what I'm saying. And people might have different experiences and therefore come to different conclusions about how to run a domain analysis and how you don't do it. So that's why I'm really seriously interested in feedback and not just at pointing out actual mistakes.
Yeah, and for anyone listening, Markus's email address is right there in the introduction. He's very serious about it. I would say it's interesting with respect to, and like just sort of getting into the weeds of the publishing world and writing world and things like that. The idea of feedback and is sort of changes when you're sort of self-publishing, right? Because the text is entirely under your control, and so for example, and you can actually change and update chapters that you've already published, as opposed to responding by publishing a new chapter on something that you otherwise wouldn't have written about if it weren't for the feedback or something like that. And that's been just one of the sort of interesting things about our sort of journey at Leanpub, right? Is because the idea of changing something that you've already written in response to feedback from someone was a sort of alien concept. You could maybe make a new edition or something like that, but the very text out there and changing that was something relatively new. And I would say that in the past, a lot of authors were sort of trepidatious about putting their email address out there, about inviting feedback and things like that. And I confess I sort of never really understood where that came from. Why you wouldn't want to be contacted. I mean, if you read about authors in the past, they would get bucket loads of mail and they would reply to them by hand, things like that, like this.
First of all, my email address is out there anyway,
right.
My website. And second, I'm not expecting to sell 1 million copies, right? And then be swamped by lots of email. So this is a niche topic. I'm not gonna give any estimates of how many copies I'll sell, but let me put it this way. I suspect that even if every reader would send me an email, I would be able to cope with that.
Well, let's hope you get that problem. But it is. I mean, in our experience, most like authors, like readers love to contact authors. They love to hear back from them. They like to get in conversations. One thing they absolutely love is if they can help improve the book. Even if it's a typo, or something like that. The sort of thrill of sort of contacting an author and saying, hey, there's a typo on page 5, and they're like, oh, thanks, let me change it and update it. It's just really great to see that happen. But of course, there's the higher level kind of feedback that you're talking about as well. That's also really important. I mentioned you've got a great cover, and I know you work with various people. You've had the same, I think, sort of copy editor for years that you mentioned at the beginning of your book. So how did you get your great cover?
I don't know. I played around and.
Oh, you made it yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I think I played with Adobe Express. It's this kind of online social media style, quickly draw something that looks kind of fancy and has nice fonts kind of thing.
Okay.
And I think that's where I stumbled over something like this.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for mentioning the very specific tool. We save these kinds of conversations for the end of the podcast. And as I mentioned before we started recording, there are some people who skip to the end because they're like, wow, learning about a new tool like that can actually now I'm going to have a great book cover myself or something like that, which can be really good.
I guess it was, if I had to redesign it today, I would probably go to Midjourney and have it come up with something fancy, some AI kind of automatically generated thing. But when I did this, when I did this thing, this Midjourney stuff wasn't yet public, so I had to use the non-artificial brain to. Yeah, but I don't know.
No, automatic. I mean, the AI generated book covers is a reality going forward now, it's going to improve a lot of book covers, frankly.
Yes, probably.
The last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest has published a book on Leanpub, is if there was anything about Leanpub that when you were using it that had you sort of shaking your fist at the screen and yelling at you, damn you, Leanpub, or if there was any magical feature so if there's any sort of terrible thing we could fix for you, or if there was any magical feature we could build for you, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
Actually, I haven't used a lot of the features yet. It's my first book on Leanpub, and I haven't used a lot of options, so I haven't shaken my fist. What I actually found funny, I'm not saying that because disclaimer, you didn't ask me to say that, but I actually really do like the experience on Leanpub. And one thing where I noticed this, and where I specifically had exactly that thought that I like it, was when so I had the book online for a while, and people could say how much they would want to pay as part of the interest registration, whatever. And when I then went to the price setting tab, Leanpub basically said, people, said what they were going to pay, and here is the average value, and here's the mean value, and we would suggest you use the mean because, and then there's a paragraph of explanation why mean is better than average, and you can of course also use any other number, any other price, but experience tells. And I found this really useful, right? This wasn't some ununderstandable either statistics or marketing gibberish, right? It was actually the exactly right level of abstraction and nerdiness that helped me decide on the price. And I actually did use the price you guys suggested. So I found this really nice. So I thought, that there's people there who are actually thinking about the author and the actual problems you have. So what is a good price, right? So anyway, found this a nice experience.
Thanks very much for sharing that. That's really good feedback. My colleague Peter will appreciate it when I tell him about that you like that, because he wrote that. For anyone listening who's sort of curious about what Markus was talking about, so when you create a book on Leanpub, even before you hit the publish button, you get a landing page that gives people an opportunity to sort of sign up to be notified when it's published. They don't have to, and by the way, they don't actually have to share their email address with the author or anything like that. It can be blind. But what they can do is they can say how much they pay for the book, which then gives you like really great feedback actually as an author about potential pricing and things like that. But as an author, when you're on the sort of in the author app, as we call it, sort of side of Leanpub, we have this sort of long, this sort of Leanpub goes in for these what we call the wall of text, but we like to explain things at length, and there are some people who are like, oh my God, wall of text. That's not book authors.
Yeah, true.
They typically like to read, and so we sort of, at least that's our theory, and so we take advantage of that, and so we actually have the opportunity to explain things at some length. And as you're saying, pricing is really hard. It's really hard to know what the right thing is, and then you come to Leanpub, and it's like I set two prices. A minimum price and a suggested price, and then people get to choose what to pay. That's actually actually explaining, okay, here's how this works. Here's one framework for making a decision about pricing and things like that, is really important, particularly for people who want to get things right, if you know what I mean. There's a sort of seat of the pants kind of person who's like, whatever, $9.99. And I'm never going to figure it out. There's no system. But there are other people like, there might actually be something to figure out here. And so we do like to provide that level of analysis to some extent where we can. Well, Markus, thank you very much for taking some time out of your evening to talk to me and to talk to all of us. And thank you very much for using Leanpub as one of the platforms for publishing your book. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity here and for building Leanpub, I guess.
Thanks.